Hello, I'm David Morris and welcome to 2025. It feels like 1925 sometimes though. From Donald Trump, the US President-elect, launching expansionist claims on Greenland, Panama, even Canada, to an emerging German leader who's channeling blame and resentment against a minority ethnic group. It really feels like the 1920s or 1930s again. Why is this? Well, there are three trends that I've thought about deeply, and I've written about them in my forthcoming book, A New Era of Risk. Three related trends here that I think we're seeing in the mid-2020s that are a little bit like the 1920s. One is the return of geopolitics. It has seemed to many that the word's always been around, but actually it was invented in the early 20th century, around 100 years, well, a little bit more than 100 years ago, but it really took hold in the 1920s when Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union had these grand imaginings that they needed to expand their geography. They needed to dominate their regions, and this was imagined to be an imperative, a geopolitical imperative. It was a natural right that the leaders of these countries believed they had. Now, all of that sounds like boring history, I know, but this concept of geopolitics, that great powers have the ability to expand and dominate other countries, is something that was given this name and given this credibility, if you like, by this word geopolitics, and that word is back. Everyone is using it in the United States, in China, everywhere. So this is why it's worth thinking about what the return of this geopolitical thinking means. If the US President-elect is saying, oh, you know, we should really be controlling Greenland, we should be controlling Canada, is he just playing games with us? Or is he testing whether actually these ideas are deemed acceptable in the world of today? We're not surprised when Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine or other areas around the former perimeter of the old Soviet Union. But when the United States starts talking about expanding its power and its presence, this is something we really need to think about very seriously. And what are the implications for other rising powers as well? So there's the return of geopolitics. But it's not just that that's happening. It's happening at the same time as the return of an ethno-nationalist agenda. Now again, this just sounds like jargon, I know, but in the 1930s we had Germany, for example, imagining in that book Mein Kampf that Adolf Hitler wrote in 1925, exactly 100 years ago, he talked about a pure German race, a master race. One ethnic group should dominate this expanding Greater Germany. We have the same concept coming back 100 years later. Around the world, we're hearing similar kinds of ideas that one dominant ethnic group defines a nation and this sidelines other minority groups. This is again an alarming trend, something we need to think about very carefully, because when you combine those two things, leaders who want to geopolitically expand and leaders who are channeling blame and resentment against a minority group and celebrating one dominant ethnic group, you have the seeds of disaster. And the third thing that we all remember from 100 years ago, we all remember from Nazi Germany, from Japan, propaganda. Now, every country arguably does it. Every politician arguably engages in a bit of propaganda. There's harmless propaganda where people just select their own facts for what they present as their political point of view. We expect that. But when it's outright fake news and when it's broadcast across major mainstream platforms and presented as if it's truth, this becomes extremely dangerous again, particularly when you combine it with those other two trends: geopolitics, ethno-nationalism and fake news. The three together are a very potent mix. Now, when we saw those three combined before in the 1920s and 1930s, coming out of economic depression, coming out of a pandemic, we saw World War II. We saw these powers going at it, complete total war and destruction of civilized societies all over the world at that time. The reconstruction had hardly begun when actually the world divided again into two competing geopolitical forces in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union and the United States imagined that they had to control rival camps, rival regions of the world. So geopolitical thinking, it's been around for a long time, but we started to move away from it. And that happened at the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, America imagined that it had won. Actually, what happened was that countries around the world discovered that actually it worked much better for them if they became interdependent, if they traded with each other, if they lived at peace. People are better off, countries are better off. So through the post-Cold War era, through those 3 decades after 1989, most of the world was at peace, most of the world was trading, and a much larger proportion of the world than ever before became rich. Now, here's the rub, here's the problem. Those parts of the world that had traditionally dominated the world, the US, the UK, in these places, they pursued economic policies that weakened their middle class and that actually destroyed parts of their middle class and part of their industrial base. And so in those countries, they were starting to hurt at the very time that the rest of the world was expanding, at the very time that the global middle class had grown by 1 billion extra people. People in Asia, in my part of the world, were starting to do much better. But people in the UK and the US in particular were really starting to hurt. And by the time of the global financial crisis, of course, it was time to start blaming. And we saw the emergence of this new populism that came from that economic crisis that happened within the financial system of the United States and the European Union. So it wasn't caused by some small minority group. It wasn't caused by the poor. It was caused by the financial mismanagement of those economies. But the blame was not given to the super rich or the finance sector. The blame was channeled by these emerging populist leaders against unpopular minorities, against refugees. Trump started to blame Mexicans for everything. In the European Union, Muslim refugees started to be blamed for everything. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't individuals who committed crimes. It doesn't mean there weren't things that were used as facts as the basis of this new narrative. But the overwhelming political agenda of blaming minorities has a long history and a dark history. And it's been in recent years that we've seen this re-emergence of these populist leaders doing just that. So when Henry Ford congratulated Adolf Hitler 100 years ago for his sensible policies, everyone was shocked. Today, when Elon Musk congratulates the leader of the Alternative for Germany for her sensible policies, what happens? Well, it gets broadcast all over the media. Apparently his videos that he made with the leader of the Alternative for Germany, Alice Weidel, have gone viral. And in these videos, Elon Musk celebrates her, treats her as a friend, chats with her, doesn't question her, doesn't ask her about her policies, what actually her policies would do to Germany. He just has this friendly chat supporting her, giving her a platform. Well, we've seen this kind of soft soap propaganda before, and we really do need to be alert to it. So fake news is a dangerous phenomenon. It's also particularly dangerous because, as we know, the trusted, reliable, professionally trained journalists who worked in mainstream media of the past, we know the business model has gone for that. We know that media now has become very fragmented, very reliant on the advertising dollar for getting your eyeballs onto your mobile phone to see some sensational piece of news. We read much more sensational news than actually evidence-based useful knowledge that we used to be able to get from common sources. We used to watch the same news, we used to read the same newspapers. Even if we disagreed about our views, we knew that we could trust the facts that we were debating. Today it's all alternative facts, it's all fake news. How are we even able to have a depolarised conversation? We're polarised, we're separated into these different bubbles where we're just talking different languages. So I watched and listened to these videos that Elon Musk has made with Alice Weidel, the leader of this Alternative for Germany, as they call their movement. And I heard her, in a very subtle way, her usual channeling of blame and discontent in relation to Muslim refugees who came into Germany. I understand that Germany and the European Union, and the United States for that matter, appear to have mismanaged their immigration programs very poorly, appear to have managed their borders very poorly, and have allowed some people in who probably should not have been allowed in. But overwhelmingly, we also know that refugee programs can be successful and can be well managed. So rather than having the debate about how do you do this better, to give a platform to someone who is just channeling blame at the actual people themselves who fled the chaos and the warfare in the Middle East, it's not a solution. I think people are looking for solutions, and I think populist leaders, like in the 1920s and 30s, offered simple solutions. Blame them. It's all their fault. It's not the fault of the financial system. It's not the fault of the rich guys, because we might need the rich guys to fund us and to support us. Let's blame them. Well, that's what we're seeing again. We do, though, need solutions. We do need solutions to the economic problems that some countries, actually many countries, are facing right now. After COVID, after the slowdown of the giant Chinese economy, there are lots of reasons why we need to find solutions, but it would be nice if we could have a fact-based, evidence-based discussion. In 1925, Mussolini declared himself Il Duce. You know, he had the answers, and there was an ethno-nationalist agenda for this greater Italy. We know what Hitler was doing in 1925 and what he did later in the 1930s and 40s. In 1925, the Ku Klux Klan were marauding across the United States. They were at the peak of their power, having mass rallies of tens of thousands of people and lynching of African Americans. In 1925, the Japanese war machine was growing. Japan was investing in its industrial capacity to launch what had already begun. Japan had already started to expand itself, but it was launching itself on the road to a destructive empire. Are we back in 1925 again? Are we seeing geopolitics, ethno-nationalism, propaganda positioning us for some grand new clash of powers? Or are there alternatives here? Could we actually sit down and talk about what are the solutions? How could we solve immigration? How could we solve economic policy? How could countries actually live at peace? They're hard things to do. That takes real leadership. It takes wise leadership. But never has populism and ethno-nationalism and geopolitics and propaganda solved a problem. It has led to the destruction of civilised societies everywhere. So let's hope it's not 1925 again.